Good morning. I am Nicola Short and I'm joined by Carolyn Hill from Aotearoa New Zealand, and today we're going to be talking about cultural landscapes in Aotearoa, specifically issues to do with decolonisation and some of the challenges that we are facing. Could I have the next slide, please? Just very quickly, we're going to go do an overview of the legislative and key policy issues that have been operating in Aotearoa. We're going to look at the current state, particularly through case studies. We're going to look at a place called Ihamatao and look at issues to do with urban form. And we will conclude by summarising the key challenges as we see them. Next slide, please. So as an overview of the last 200 years of legislation and policy for settlers and Māori, this slide summarises those key moves and key challenges. And the points that we want to make are that the general movements in heritage identification and protection for cultural landscapes follows broadly the same moves that you would see in other parts of the world. One of the specific elements of any legislative or policy changes or development in New Zealand is Te Tiriti o Waitangi, that was signed in 1840 as the core constitutional arrangements between Indigenous peoples and the settler government. That was in 1840. You can see that in the top left-hand corner of the slide. The first heritage site in New Zealand to be afforded legal protection was a cultural landscape in 1896. And also, as most of you will probably know, if not all, the first cultural landscape to go onto the World Heritage list was Tongariro in New Zealand. Despite this, these events in terms of the importance of cultural landscapes in Aotearoa, we do not have legislative support or protection for cultural landscapes currently. And it is kind of counterintuitive that in a country where clearly cultural landscapes are a very important part of our heritage, we have not had within our legislation anything specifically protecting or identifying cultural landscapes. The other point is that, just to bring your attention to the primary form of environmental and heritage legislation in New Zealand is what is known as the Resource Management Act, or the RMA. And I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail now. Could I have the next slide, please? So this are the movements over the last 15 years. And I wanted to start in 2007 with the signing of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because this declaration has significant impacts on the way that we are framing and viewing the responsibilities and the developments of our legislative environment and frameworks in Aotearoa now. If you have a look at the far left right-hand side of your screen, in 2020, you can see that the RMA, it was determined that the RMA, the core piece of environmental and heritage legislation, it was decided that it would be disestablished. It will now be replaced with what is known as the MBA, or the Natural and Built Environments Act. The important thing to understand here is that this new piece of legislation, which is currently in development, does have a Māori perspective in terms of the way that it views the environment, and importantly for us, it does include for the first time a definition and identification of cultural landscapes. However, there are other elements that in the development of this bill which have cause for concern and have a counterintuitive perspective, which we perceive will impact how we see, view, and potentially protect cultural landscapes in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'll hand over to Carolyn now to look at some case studies, and have the next slide, please.
Carolyn, we can't hear you.
Kia ora, apologies. So cultural landscapes in Aotearoa have not been defined to date. And this is an interesting example in Auckland, Tamaki Makaurau, of cultural landscapes by accident, where volcanic view shafts have been protected for some decades for their picturesque qualities, so views back and forth from these volcanoes. But because of this accidental protection, we now have the ability to enable new generations to reconnect to this whole of area cultural landscape in a holistic, whenua, land-centered way. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, housing pressures are intense here in Aotearoa right now, and combined with the legislative change of the NBA, which is throwing out the idea of amenity, but potentially bringing in this idea of cultural landscape, we've got potential for significant societal conflict in these spaces, with cultural landscape having potential to be used for tied to issues of gentrification. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, iwi and hapu tribal leader groups are regathering their people on their whenua, on their land, both through treaty settlements, but also through land, ironically, land repurchase. The ways these places are being used in Māori-led ways may reshape Aotearoa's specific ways of understanding and legislating for cultural landscapes. This is certainly new ground. Next slide, please.
So looking at a specific site, the site of Ihamatao, a number of these issues that are kind of currently challenging our legislative and policy environment exist in this particular case. So we have an issue of private land, and it needs to be understood that in the treaty settlement process, where the Crown is negotiating with different iwi groups for some kind of compensation for some of the impacts of colonisation, what is excluded from those discussions is private land. And so we have a situation where we have a really important cultural landscape, which is largely in private, the land is largely in private ownership. And there has been a campaign to protect the cultural landscape that has been iwi-led, and it addresses some of the constitutional, legal and policy issues that we have highlighted today, those being those issues to do with the rights of Māori to determine by Māori for Māori what a cultural landscape is, or the importance of land to them, the cultural significance of the land to them and how that would be managed, and the right for access and the right for that connection to the whenua. So whilst there have been a range of positive moves in the development of new legislation and policy, we still see that there are a number of kind of fundamental issues which sit at the heart of our legislative and policy environments, which still challenge the ability not only to identify, recognise and protect cultural landscapes, but also to ensure that the Indigenous people of New Zealand have the power and the rights to make decisions over those places that are important to them. Could I have the next slide, please?
Sorry, your time is up.
That's cool, because that's the last slide. Phew. Okay, so just in summary, the key challenges as we see them have to do with decision making, with governance, the impact of Indigenous rights and treaty settlements, those legislative changes that we identified, and the impacts on urban form. Kia ora koutou katoa.